Welcome to Blind History with Josh Berry. Over the next few weeks, we will be diving into the history of Egypt. Here is the full article, Part 5. Late Period Persian Rule and Alexander the Great. The end of the New Kingdom and the road to the Late Period, when the New Kingdom faded at the end of the 20th Dynasty. Egypt did not immediately fall into total chaos, but the centralized, expansive imperial state that had reached into Nubia and the Levant was gone. The pharaohs no longer commanded the same unquestioned authority at home or abroad. Instead, Egypt drifted into a pattern of divided rule, foreign pressure, and internal power struggles that set the stage for what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, and ultimately the Late Period. That collapse should not be imagined as a single dramatic event, as though one dynasty ended and everything simply fell apart overnight. It was more gradual than that. The New Kingdom's institutions continued to function, but they did so in a more fragmented political landscape. The royal court no longer had the same reach into the provinces, and local elites aimed greater independence as the center weakened. Egypt still looked like Egypt, but it was no longer governed with the confidence or coherence of the great imperial age. This transitional era saw power dispersed among several competing centers. In the north, kings ruled from the delta, while in the south, powerful high priests of Amun at Thebes controlled large territories and resources. The division between royal and priestly spheres, which had been simmering during the New Kingdom, now became a structural feature of politics. Local dynasties, Libyan chieftains, and other groups entered the mix, each staking claims to legitimacy using the vocabulary of traditional kingship, even as the practical realities of power changed.
One of the most important reasons this mattered is that Egyptian kingship was never just about military control. It was also about religious legitimacy, order, and the ability to maintain maat, the proper balance of the world.
If a pharaoh could no longer guarantee security, prosperity, and ritual regularity across the whole country, then other figures, priests, regional rulers, temple leaders, and even foreign-backed local dynasts could begin to occupy the space where royal authority should have been. In that sense, the political fragmentation of the Third Intermediate Period was also a crisis of symbolic order. As this pattern continued over generations, the idea of a strong unitary Egypt remained, but the reality was more fractured. Foreign powers, especially from the Near East, watched closely, intervening when it suited their interests. By the time we reach what scholars call the Late Period, Egypt has already experienced extended episodes of both native revival and foreign domination, including Libyan and Nubian Kushite rulers who tried to restore old glories while responding to new geopolitical realities. It is worth pausing on that point because it helps explain the tone of the later centuries. The Late Period was not an age of simple decline. It was an age of memory, recovery, and reinvention under pressure. Egyptians repeatedly looked backward in order to move forward. They revived older forms of art, religion, and kingship not because they were incapable of innovation, but because those older forms offered the strongest available language for stability in a world that had become unstable. Defining the Late Period of Egyptian history is usually dated from the 26th Dynasty, the Said Dynasty, around the 7th century BCE, down to the conquest of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. It is late from the perspective of pharaonic tradition, but it is also a time of remarkable cultural resilience and adaptation. The Egypt of this era was fully aware that it had a long past. Kings consciously imitated Old and New Kingdom styles, revived archaic names, and restored old temples as a way to anchor their rule in an idealized golden age. That backward-looking quality is one of the defining features of the period, but it should not be mistaken for simple conservatism. The Late Period was not merely trying to preserve what already existed. It was engaged in an active act of cultural selection. Leaders and priestly elites chose which parts of the Egyptian past to emphasize, which visual forms to revive, and which institutions to strengthen. The result was a culture that was deeply traditional in self-presentation, but still responsive to changing political realities. Politically, the Late Period is characterized by repeated shifts between native and foreign rule. Egypt came under the shadow of large Near Eastern empires, Assyrian, then Babylonian, and ultimately Persian, yet it periodically reasserted independence under energetic native dynasties. Its strategic location, wealth, and symbolic prestige made it a prize that great powers sought to control, either directly or through vassals. At the same time, Egypt's society and culture were not static. Foreign traders, mercenaries, and administrators took up residence in Nile-side cities. Greek merchants established communities in places like Naucratis, integrating Egypt in the wider Mediterranean networks. Egyptian religion, art, and intellectual life interacted with these newcomers, producing new syntheses without losing their distinct identity. This tension between continuity and change runs through the whole era. The Late Period is often introduced as the last great chapter of native pharaonic civilization before the age of Macedonian Roman domination, but that framing can obscure how dynamic the period actually was. It was a time when Egypt had to define itself more self-consciously than ever before, precisely because the old assumptions of power no longer held automatically. The site revival, Egypt looks to its past. The 26th Dynasty, based its size in the Western Delta, presided over one of the most striking periods of cultural revival in Egypt's long history. These kings, often called the site pharaohs, consciously emulated the forms and ideals of earlier epics, especially the Old Kingdom and New Kingdom. They sponsored restorations of ancient temples, commissioned copies of old texts, and revived archaic artistic styles, all while navigating the complex political landscape of the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. The site rulers took power in a world dominated by large empires to the northeast. Assyria had already intervened in Egyptian politics, installing and removing local wars according to its strategic interests. As Assyrian power declined, the Sayyid kings seized the opportunity to assert more independence. They engaged in diplomacy and war, not only with Near Eastern states, but also with the rising Greek city-states, which were beginning to look eastward for trade and influence. The founder of the dynasty, Psamtik I, is especially important because he transformed a moment of weakness into one of restoration. He was able to unify much of Egypt and establish Sais as the center of a new political order. His reign is often associated with the recovery of Egyptian autonomy and the reorganization of the state after decades of division. He also understood that military power alone was not enough. He had to build legitimacy, and legitimacy in Egypt meant linking himself to temple wealth, religious authority, and the heritage of the old kings. Internally, the Site dynasty attempted to restore a strong central administration. They reorganized the bureaucracy, reaffirmed royal control over key temples and estates, and reasserted Egypt's presence in Nubia and the Levant where possible. However, they could no longer project power on the scale of the new kingdom. Instead, they relied on a mix of Egyptian troops and foreign mercenaries, Greeks, Carians, and others, to defend their borders and pursue limited campaigns. This reliance on outsiders was not necessarily a sign of weakness, so much as a sign of adaptation. Egypt's rulers were operating in a Mediterranean world where military expertise and commercial mobility increasingly depended on trans-regional networks. The Psyche kings were not isolated traditionalists. They were pragmatic statesmen trying to rebuild a strong kingdom using whatever resources were available. Cultural life and intellectual trends under the Site kings. Despite political constraints, the Site period was a time of intellectual and artistic renaissance. Scribes and priests collected, edited, and recopied older religious and literary texts. Compilations of wisdom literature, ritual instructions, and theological works took shape in forms that would influence later traditions, including Greek and Roman understandings of Egypt. This manuscript culture mattered because it preserved an enormous amount of Egypt's earlier religious and literary heritage. Temples were not just ritual sites, they were centers of textual continuity. Priests copied old inscriptions, maintained sacred knowledge, and passed down interpretive traditions that connected current practice with ancient precedent. In a world where political fragmentation had endangered centralized memory, scribal and priestly institutions became guardians of civilization itself. Artistic production during this time is sometimes described as archaizing, meaning that it deliberately imitated older styles. Statues of kings and officials might adopt Old Kingdom proportions and poses, while temple reliefs echoed the compositions of New Kingdom monuments. This was not mere nostalgia, it was a way of asserting continuity, claiming that the present rulers stood in unbroken succession to the legendary pharaohs who had built the pyramids and defeated foreign enemies. At the same time, Site artists and thinkers added their own touches. Subtle variations in detail, costume, and facial expression distinguish late period works from their models. Innovations in temple organization, funerary equipment, and religious iconography show that the culture was still alive, capable of development, and not simply copying the past mechanically. That distinction is important. Sometimes late period art is described as if it were a pale imitation of earlier grandeur, but that misses the sophistication of the era. Its creators were not trapped by tradition, they were working creatively within it. The goal is to produce forms that felt ancient, authoritative, and sacred while still addressing contemporary needs. Egypt and the Greek world. One of the defining features of the late period is these communities in the form of Greek tactics played with the establishment of the education. The Site kings, recognizing the military and commercial value of Greek allies, granted privileges to Greek mercenaries and traders. They established Nokratis in the Delta as a designated Greek trading port and settlement, allowing various Greek city-states to maintain sanctuaries and warehouses there. No Kratos became more than just a commercial outpost. It was a point of contact between worlds. Greek settlers could live there under agreed terms, conduct trade, and maintain communal institutions. For Egyptians, it brought foreign merchants and artisans into a structured relationship with the state rather than leaving them as uncontrolled outsiders. In practical terms, it allowed Egypt to benefit from Mediterranean trade while limiting the risks of informal foreign settlement. This arrangement created a bridge between the Nile Valley and the Aegean. Greek merchants brought wine, olive oil, pottery, and other goods to Egypt, while exporting grain, papyrus, linen, and perhaps luxury items. They also carried Egyptian ideas and imagery back to the Greek world, where Egyptian wisdom and the antiquity of Egypt became themes in Greek literature, philosophy, and myth. Cultural interaction went both ways. Egyptians encountered Greek language, art, and social customs, sometimes adopting Greek mercenaries into their service and allowing Greek communities certain degrees of self-governance. Greek travelers in turn visited temples and consulted Egyptian priests, later writing accounts, part accurate, part imaginative, that colored how the wider Mediterranean perceived Egypt. This interaction had long-term consequences. Greeks increasingly imagined Egypt as an ancient, mysterious, and intellectually authoritative civilization. Egyptians, meanwhile, had to manage a world in which foreign military and commercial communities were becoming part of the political landscape. The result was not homogenization, but coexistence, competition, and selective exchange. The first Persian conquest, Egypt as a satrapy. Despite their efforts, the Scythe kings could not indefinitely hold back the rising power of the Persian Empire. Under the Achaemenid dynasty, Persia expanded rapidly, absorbing the territories of Babylon and many smaller states. Egypt, wealthy and strategically important, was an obvious next target. In the mid-6th century BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II launched a campaign against Egypt, culminating in its conquest. The Persian invasion did not happen in a vacuum. Egypt's own diplomacy and foreign entanglements helped shape the crisis. Greek mercenaries and regional allies were already part of the military picture, and the state's dependence on a mix of local and foreign forces reflected the changing nature of late pharaonic power. Cambyses exploited that situation skillfully. An Egyptian resistance, though real, could not fully withstand the imperial pressure. With this victory, Egypt became a satrapy or province of the Achaemenid Empire. Persian rule did not erase Egyptian institutions overnight, but it altered the framework in which they operated. A Persian satrap, often a member of the royal family or a trusted noble, governed the country, overseeing taxation, justice, and military matters. Local Egyptian officials and priests continued to function, but they now served under imperial authority. The Persians were not simply occupiers imposing total foreign control. They were imperial administrators who understood that Egypt had to be governed through existing structures as much as through force. The temple system remained valuable. Local administrative habits remained useful. Even the symbolism of pharaonic kingship remained politically important because a ruler who claimed Egypt without acknowledging Egyptian religious legitimacy risked provoking unrest. Persian kings presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs when addressing Egyptian audiences. They adopted Egyptian royal titles, contributed to temple building, and participated, at least symbolically, in Egyptian religious life. From the imperial perspective, Egypt was one among many culturally distinct provinces, each governed with a mix of respect for local traditions and assertion of central control. Still, the psychological effect of conquest was profound. The very fact that Egypt, long the self-image of an ancient and independent civilization, could be absorbed into a foreign empire was a sign that the old political order had changed irrevocably. The pharaoh was now part of a larger imperial hierarchy, and that transformation would shape Egyptian politics for generations. Egyptian responses to Persian rule. Egyptian attitudes toward Persian rule were complex and varied. Some elites cooperated with the new regime, seeing advantages in maintaining their positions under Persian oversight and benefiting from imperial trade networks and protection. Persian rulers could be generous patrons of temples and were sometimes careful to depict themselves as upholders of maat in Egyptian inscriptions. This cooperation should not be read as simple submission. For many local elites, working with Persian rulers was a practical strategy for preserving influence, land, and religious standing. Temples still needed protection, landholdings still needed management, and local administration still had to function. If Persian rule could be accommodated rather than openly resisted, then some continuity might be preserved. Yet there was also resentment and resistance. Periodic revolts broke out, often led by local dynasts or priests, who claimed to restore native rule and expel the foreign oppressor. These uprisings occasionally achieved temporary success, establishing independent regimes that lasted for a generation or two before being reconquered. The very fact that such revolts occurred shows that many Egyptians did not fully accept Persian rule as legitimate. Propaganda on both sides played a role in how these events were remembered. Greek and later sources often emphasized Persian impiety or cruelty, painting the conquest in dark colors to serve their own political narratives. Egyptian priests writing under later native or Hellenistic rulers could likewise depict Persian kings unfavorably to flatter their current patrons. The reality was likely more nuanced, with some reigns marked by relative calm and others by heavy-handed interference. What seems clear is that Persian rule was never purely a matter of simple occupation. It was a negotiated and often unstable relationship between imperial power and local tradition. The Persians governed through Egyptian institutions even as they asserted authority over them, and Egyptians responded by using those same institutions to preserve as much autonomy as they could. Brief restorations of native rule between waves of Persian domination, Egypt experienced brief periods of renewed independence under native dynasties, sometimes counted as the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties. These rulers typically emerged from revolts or regional power bases and portrayed themselves as defenders of Egyptian tradition against foreign aggression. They invested heavily in temple building and restoration, seeking divine favor and popular support by associating themselves with ancient sacred sites and rituals. These restorations mattered not only because they briefly returned Egyptian rulers to the throne, but because they revealed how enduring the idea of native kingship remained. Even after conquest and foreign pressure, Egyptians could still imagine legitimate rule in the older pharaonic style. A restored king could present himself as a restorer of order, a defender of the gods, and a champion of the country's ancient identity. That was especially important in a world where legitimacy was increasingly contested and had to be reaffirmed visibly through monuments, priestly support, and military success. The most successful of these native revivals drew strength from a combination of local loyalty and practical diplomacy. They were not simply anti-foreign reactions. They were attempts to rebuild a viable Egyptian state in a difficult geopolitical environment. The kings of these dynasties knew that survival depended on more than ritual language. They needed allies, resources, garrisons, and the support of temple elites who could help bind the country together. As a result, their reigns often mixed conservatism with realism, reverence for the past with tactical engagement in the present. However, these regimes operated under constant external pressure. The Achaemenid Empire remained a formidable presence, and Greek city-states and other regional powers pursued their own interests in the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian kings sometimes sought alliances with Greek powers, hiring Greek mercenaries, and entering into diplomatic arrangements to counterbalance Persian strength. This pattern of fragile independence followed by reconquest created a sense of precariousness. Egyptians could celebrate temporary victories and revivals, but they also knew that their autonomy depended on a delicate balance of internal cohesion and external circumstances. The stage was set for a new wave of conquest by a very different kind of empire, that of Alexander the Great. The idea of restoration is important here because it captures something that appears repeatedly throughout the late period. Egyptian rulers were not simply trying to preserve what remained, they were trying to recreate a usable version of the past. That meant temples had to be repaired, ancient religious formulas had to be revived, and the king had to appear as the rightful heir of a much older sacred order. In that sense, the native dynasties of the late period were always working against time. They had to prove that Egypt still had the power to be Egypt in the old sense, even though the larger world around it had already changed. The Second Persian period and the final native pharaohs. In the 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire reasserted control over Egypt, inaugurating what is sometimes called the Second Persian period. Persian kings again acted as pharaohs in an Egyptian context, depending on local administrators and temple elites to manage daily affairs, while using Persian military might to deter rebellion and repel foreign invaders. This second conquest is sometimes overshadowed by the more famous arrival of Alexander, but it was a crucial moment in its own right. It confirmed that Egypt remained vulnerable to imperial intervention, and it exposed the limits of the short-lived native restorations that had followed the earlier Persian occupation. The return of Persian power was a reminder that the political world of the Eastern Mediterranean had become increasingly interconnected and militarized. Egypt could no longer assume that distance or tradition alone would protect it. The last native pharaohs of Egypt emerged during this turbulent time. Kings like Nectanebo I and II of the 30th Dynasty are often remembered as the final fully Egyptian rulers before the coming of Alexander. They continued the pattern of temple restorations, military preparations, and diplomatic maneuvering, seeking alliances particularly with Greek powers that might help them resist Persian encroachment. Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II are important not just because they were the last of a line, but because they represent the final attempt to preserve a recognizably Egyptian kingship before the Hellenistic age. Their rule was rooted in traditional forms of legitimacy, temple patronage, monumental construction, and the visual language of pharaonic power. At the same time, they were forced to operate in a political environment shaped by mercenaries, maritime warfare, international diplomacy, and the growing importance of the Greek world. The old order still existed, but it had to compete on new terms. Nectanebel II in particular invested heavily in monumental works and religious patronage, yet even his efforts could not permanently secure Egypt's independence. As Persian kings tried once more to reclaim Egypt, Greek politics and the rise of Macedon under Philip II and his son Alexander began to reshuffle the entire balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. The fact that Egyptian kings were increasingly dependent on Greek military support is revealing. It shows that Egyptian sovereignty had become entangled with wider Mediterranean systems. The same mercenaries who could strengthen the state could also become instruments of foreign influence. The same diplomatic contacts that helped Egypt resist Persia also made it more deeply exposed to external powers. By the time Alexander appears, the kingdom is already part of a larger struggle over control of the Eastern world. Alexander the Great and the conquest of Egypt. When Alexander the Great launched his campaign against the Persian Empire, Egypt was one part of a vast imperial system he aimed to dismantle. After his victories in Asia Minor and the Levant, he marched into Egypt, where Persian authority had already been weakened by previous conflicts. In 332 BCE, Alexander entered Egypt and was welcomed, at least in official accounts, as a liberator from Persian rule. That welcome should not be understood too simply. Many Egyptians may have seen Alexander as a preferable alternative to Persian domination, but he was still a foreign conqueror, entering a land with its own deep political and religious traditions. What made him different was his ability to recognize that fact and act accordingly. He did not try to replace Egyptian symbols with Macedonian ones. Instead, he presented himself as someone who respected local religion and could therefore be incorporated into the existing order. For many Egyptians, the replacement of a distant Persian overlord with a charismatic Macedonian conqueror may have seemed more like a change of masters than true liberation. Yet Alexander was careful to present himself as respectful of Egyptian religion and tradition. He visited Memphis, made offerings to local gods, and allowed priests and officials to continue their roles under his new regime. By adopting Egyptian royal titles and participating in key rituals, he signaled his willingness to be seen as pharaoh. This was politically shrewd because it allowed Alexander to claim Egypt without destabilizing it. He understood that the country's institutions, especially the temples and priesthoods, had to be treated as sources of legitimacy rather than obstacles to control. In a land where kingship was sacred, conquest alone was not enough. The conqueror also had to become acceptable in religious terms. One of Alexander's most significant decisions was the founding of a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. Its location, near the western edge of the Nile Delta, but slightly apart from older centers, was strategic. It offered a deep harbor, easy access to the Nile, and a position at crossroads of Mediterranean and Near Eastern trade. Alexander intended it to be both a Greek city and a capital for his Egyptian holdings. In doing so, he set in motion a process that would profoundly alter Egypt's cultural and political landscape. The future importance of Alexandria was not immediately obvious to every observer, but the site had enormous long-term potential. It connected the sea to the river system, the Greek world to the Egyptian interior, and military control to commercial expansion. It would become the great urban expression of Egypt's Hellenistic future, even if Alexander himself did not live to see that future unfold. Alexander at age.One, the question of legitimacy. A famous episode in Alexander's Egyptian sojourn was his journey to the oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, deep in the western desert. There, according to Greek sources, the oracle addressed him in a way that implied divine ancestry, possibly calling him a son of Amun, whom Greeks equated with Zeus. Whether the details are accurate or embellished, the story reflects a broader pattern. Alexander sought religious sanction for his rule, not only in Greek terms, but also within local traditions. The journey to Siwa has remained famous because it shows Alexander thinking like more than a conqueror. He was also thinking like a ruler who needed symbolic validation. For an Egyptian audience, approval from the oracle of Amun could be politically decisive. For a Greek audience, the oracle could be understood as a sign of divine favor and exceptional destiny. Alexander's genius was to make one act serve both audiences at once. By engaging with the oracle of Amun, Alexander tapped into one of the most powerful religious currents in Egyptian life. Amun, the chief god of Thebes and central to New Kingdom ideology, still commanded great reverence. If Alexander could be presented as favored or begotten by Amun, it would help legitimize his authority in Egyptian eyes, just as it could enhance his prestige among Greeks who were fascinated by exotic cults and divine oracles. This combination of military conquest, political savvy, and religious symbolism allowed Alexander to integrate Egypt into his empire with relatively little initial resistance. Yet his premature death in 323 BCE meant that he did not personally shape Egypt's long-term future. That task fell to one of his generals, Ptolemy, who had found a new dynasty that blended Greek and Egyptian elements in a distinctive Hellenistic kingdom. Alexander's brief presence in Egypt nevertheless changed everything. He opened the door to a political world in which Egypt would no longer be ruled by native pharaohs or by distant Near Eastern emperors, but by a Macedonian dynasty that adopted pharaonic forms while ruling as part of a Greek-speaking Mediterranean elite. That transformation was not merely administrative, it altered the cultural imagination of Egypt itself. From Alexander to the early Ptolemies. After Alexander's entrance into Egypt and his careful performance of pharaonic and religious roles, the country became one province within a rapidly growing Macedonian empire stretching from Greece to the edges of India. Egypt's strategic and economic value was obvious. It was a grain-rich land, a gateway to Africa, and a symbolically prestigious territory with a venerable civilization that impressed Greeks and Macedonians alike. For the short time that Alexander lived after the conquest, Egypt's administration likely combined Macedonian military oversight with continued reliance on Egyptian administrators and priests. The Macedonian and Greek elites concerned themselves with garrisons, taxation, and strategic planning, while local officials ensured that the agricultural cycle, temple rituals, and village life continued with minimal disruption. This pragmatic arrangement reduced the risk of widespread rebellion in a land that could be difficult to control if deeply alienated. That balance between continuity and oversight would become a hallmark of the Hellenistic period. The new rulers did not want to uproot the local population or disrupt the agrarian system on which Egypt depended. They wanted the country's wealth, not its destruction. In that sense, Alexander's successors inherited a land whose institutions were strong enough to survive conquest but adaptable enough to serve new masters. Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE, however, shattered any illusion of lasting imperial unity. His generals, the Diadochi, began competing over different parts of the empire. Egypt, with its natural defenses and resources, became the prize of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's close companions and a shrewd political operator. Ptolemy moved quickly to secure Egypt as his personal base, laying the foundations of a new dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. Ptolemy's success depended on speed and calculation. In a world where Alexander's empire was breaking apart, delay meant vulnerability. By moving decisively into Egypt, Ptolemy ensured that the country would become not just a satrapy in a fractured imperial system, but the core of a new independent kingdom. The long Ptolemaic age began as a political improvisation and became one of the most durable dynasties in Egyptian history. Ptolemy I, from satrap to king. Initially, Ptolemy ruled Egypt as a satrap, formerly a governor under the nominal authority of Alexander's royal heirs. In practice, he governed as an independent strongman, building up local support, strengthening garrisons, and carefully intervening in broader imperial struggles only when it served his interests. He famously seized and transported Alexander's body to Egypt, interring it first in Memphis and later in Alexandria. Possession of the conqueror's remains carried immense symbolic weight, reinforcing Ptolemy's claim to be Alexander's true successor in this region. That act was more than a political gesture, it was a statement of legitimacy. In the ancient world, control of a founder's or conqueror's body could carry extraordinary authority. By placing Alexander in Egypt, Ptolemy made the new kingdom into the resting place of empire itself. He was no longer just one general among others. He was the guardian of Alexander's memory, and therefore a figure with an elevated claim to rule. Over time, as it became clear that the unified empire could not be restored, Ptolemy took the decisive step of declaring himself king. This move formalized what had already become reality. Egypt was now the seat of a new Hellenistic kingdom, ruled by a Macedonian Greek dynasty that blended Greek and Egyptian elements in creative and sometimes tension-filled ways. Ptolemy and his successors would be pharaohs in the eyes of Egyptian subjects and basileus kings in the Greek political and cultural world. This dual identity became central to Ptolemaic governance. The Ptolemies had to speak 2 political languages at once. To Greek elites, they were Hellenistic monarchs in a competitive world of successor kingdoms. To Egyptians, they were pharaohs expected to uphold divine order and protect the temples. That made the dynasty adaptable, but it also meant that their rule was always balancing 2 different systems of legitimacy. Ptolemy I also began shaping the institutions that would make his kingdom distinctive. He continued the development of Alexandria as a metropolitan capital, patronized Greek-style civic institutions, and initiated or supported the scholarly and cultural enterprises that would make the city famous. At the same time, he recognized the importance of Egypt's priestly class and traditional temples, working with them to secure ideological and administrative stability. That combination of Hellenistic ambition and Egyptian pragmatism would define the dynasty for generations. The Ptolemies were not simply Greek rulers in Egypt. They were rulers of Egypt who understood that the country's old institutions still mattered enormously, even when those institutions now served a new kind of monarchy. The founding and early growth of Alexandria quickly became the centerpiece of the new regime. Built on the Mediterranean coast with access to both sea and river, it attracted settlers from Greece, Macedon, the wider Aegean, and the Near East, as well as local Egyptians. Its layout with a grid of streets, monumental public spaces, and separate quarters for different communities reflected Greek city planning ideas while accommodating a diverse population. The choice of location was one of the most important strategic decisions in Hellenistic history. Alexandria was not simply a city place for convenience. It was a city designed to connect systems. It linked the Nile Valley to the Mediterranean, royal power to commercial movement, and intellectual prestige to imperial administration. That combination made it more than a capital. It became a symbol of the new political world that was emerging after Alexander's conquest. The city served multiple functions: political capital. It housed the royal palace, administrative offices, and military garrisons. Commercial hub, its harbor became a major node in Mediterranean and Red Sea trade, facilitating connections between Egypt, the Greek world, the Levant, and beyond. Cultural center, through world patronage, Alexandria developed into an intellectual powerhouse, attracting scholars, poets, philosophers, and scientists. What made Alexandria initially powerful is the way these roles reinforced one another. Trade brought wealth. Wealth supported buildings, scholars, and fleets. Scholarship enhanced the city's prestige. Prestige in turn strengthened the dynasty's image as a ruler of civilization rather than merely of territory. In other words, Alexandria did not just reflect Ptolemaic rule, it helped make Ptolemaic rule possible. The large lighthouse on the nearby island of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, symbolized Alexandria's role as a beacon for ships and ideas. Its towering presence reflected not just practical navigational needs, but also the Ptolemies' desire to display their wealth, technical skill, and cosmopolitan ambition. The lighthouse is important because it captures the spirit of the city, visible, commanding, and oriented toward the wider world. Alexandria wanted to be seen. It was meant to announce the presence of a dynasty that could outshine rivals in both power and culture. The city was an urban statement of legitimacy, one made in stone, harbor engineering, and monumental scale. Greeks, Macedonians, and Egyptians, a complex society under the Ptolemies. Egyptian society became even more layered and multi-ethnic. At the top stood the Macedonian and Greek ruling elite, the king and royal family, high officials, military commanders, and wealthy settlers who received land grants in return for service. They often lived in or around Alexandria and other Greek-founded cities, speaking Greek, practicing Greek customs, and participating in institutions modeled on Greek city-states. The hierarchy of the kingdom mattered because it shaped everyday experience. Political power was concentrated in the Greek-speaking elite, while the native Egyptian majority remained the backbone of agricultural production and local religious life. That arrangement did not mean the two groups lived entirely separate lives, but it did mean that they occupied different positions within the state and often experienced it differently. At the same time, a vast majority of the population remained Egyptian peasants, craftspeople, and local elites, who continued to live in traditional villages and towns along the Nile. They spoke Egyptian in its later forms, worshipped ancient gods, and maintained long-established social structures and rituals. Temples and priesthoods remained central to local life, acting as both religious centers and economic institutions. The coexistence of Greek and Egyptian communities created a kingdom that was not culturally uniform but structurally integrated. The state depended on the labor of Egyptian agricultural workers, the administrative practices of Greek elites, and the mediation of bilingual or bicultural intermediaries. That made Ptolemaic Egypt one of the most complex societies in the ancient world. Between these broad groups, many intermediate and mixed identities emerged. Egyptian elites who learned Greek and participated in the royal administration. Greek or Macedonian individuals who adopted Egyptian religious practices or intermarried with local families. These overlapping identities mattered because they show that Greek and Egyptian were not fixed social boxes. They were often practical labels that could be negotiated depending on context. A man might be Greek in official records, Egyptian in temple settings, and something in between in commercial life. In that sense, Ptolemaic Egypt was a place where identity became more fluid even as hierarchy remained strong. The Ptolemaic administration often codified and managed these differences. Different legal systems might apply to Greeks and Egyptians. Different tax regimes could reflect status, occupation, and place of residence. Over centuries, however, the lines between groups blurred, especially outside Alexandria, creating a more hybrid society. That hybridity is one of the defining characteristics of the Hellenistic age. The Ptolemaic state did not erase Egyptian identity. It placed it in conversation with a Greek ruling culture and a broader Mediterranean world. That produced tension, but it also produced new forms of life that were neither purely local nor simply imported from abroad. The Ptolemaic state, administration, and economy. The Ptolemaic rulers inherited and transformed Egypt's long-standing system of state control over land and resources. They treated much of the land as royal domain, granting segments to soldiers and officials while maintaining a strong say in agricultural production and trade. Taxes in kind and money were rigorously assessed and collected, supporting the royal court, the army, and major building projects. This was a highly organized state, and its strength lay partly in its capacity to measure and document. Land was surveyed, labor was accounted for, and revenue was tracked through an extensive bureaucratic apparatus. In practical terms, the kingdom tried to make every productive activity visible to the government. That allowed the monarchy to extract resources efficiently, but it also meant that the state reached deeply into local life. A dense bureaucracy managed these operations. Greek served as the main administrative language at the top, with papyrus documents recording contracts, tax assessments, legal disputes, and official decrees. Egyptian officials and translators helped bridge the gap between Greek-speaking administrators and Egyptian-speaking rural populations. In many areas, the older temple institutions continued to play roles in local governance, particularly in land management and record-keeping. The Ptolemaic system should not be imagined as a simple top-down machine. It was more like an overlapping set of institutions that depended on cooperation, record-keeping, and negotiated authority. Local officials had to make imperial policy work in villages and districts. Temples had to align their own interests with royal demands. Soldiers had to be paid and settled. The result was a kingdom that was centralized in intent but highly mediated in practice. The economy under the Ptolemies was both centrally controlled and market-oriented. The state monopolized certain key commodities such as papyrus, oil, or certain metals, extracting profits from their production and sale. At the same time, private farmers, merchants, and artisans participated in a lively exchange economy, especially in cities and along trade routes. Egypt exported grain, papyrus, and textiles, importing wine, olive oil, luxury goods, and slaves. This economic structure made Egypt immensely important in the Mediterranean world. Grain exports gave the kingdom leverage. Imports linked it to luxury consumption and elite culture. The combination of state control and market activity also allowed the monarchy to profit from commerce while maintaining political dominance. Temples, priesthoods, and religious policy. The Ptolemaic kings understood that their rule in Egypt depended heavily on the cooperation of the temples and priesthoods. Temples were not merely religious sites, they were major landowners, employers, and cultural centers. Egyptian priests preserved and interpreted ancient traditions, controlled significant wealth, and commanded respect among the local populace. That made them indispensable. A ruler who angered the priesthood risked political trouble, religious scandal, and local resistance. A ruler who won priestly support, by contrast, could present himself as a legitimate pharaoh in the oldest and most meaningful sense. The Ptolemies knew this and responded accordingly. Ptolemaic rulers often presented themselves as pious benefactors of Egyptian religion. They financed temple construction and restoration, participated in or at least symbolically endorsed public rituals, and honored the major gods of the land. In inscriptions and reliefs at temples, they appear in fully Egyptian style, offering to the gods and upholding maat. This visual and textual integration helped legitimize them as pharaohs in the traditional sense. This was not just theatrical. Temple restoration was a real policy commitment, and it had practical consequences. It reinforced local loyalty, maintained the ritual infrastructure of the country, and tied the monarchy to the sacred geography of Egypt. The dynasty's relationship with the priesthood was therefore both ideological and administrative. At the same time, the kings also promoted religious forms that bridged Greek and Egyptian elements. One prominent example is the god Serapis, a deity with both Greek and Egyptian features, worshipped in Alexandria and other cities by mixed communities. Serapis combined aspects of Osiris, Apis, and Greek gods like Zeus or Hades, providing a focus for a universalizing cult that could appeal to Greeks and Egyptians alike. The priesthoods, in return, adapted to the new realities. They continued to produce sacred texts, decorate temple walls, and organize festivals, but they also engaged with Greek officials, learned Greek where necessary, and sometimes participated in the broader intellectual life of the kingdom. Over time, some priests acted as cultural intermediaries, explaining Egyptian lore to Greek visitors and contributing to the mystique of Egyptian wisdom in the Hellenistic world. That role as intermediary was crucial. Egyptian priests did not simply preserve the past in isolation. They helped translate it into a form that Greeks could understand, even if imperfectly. That meant they became part of the creation of Egypt's later reputation as a land of ancient secrets, sacred science, and timeless wisdom. The Library and Museum of Alexandria, one of the most celebrated institutions of Ptolemaic Egypt, was the Library of Alexandria and its associated scholarly community, sometimes called the Museum Mausean. While much about these institutions remains uncertain or idealized in later accounts, their significance in the ancient imagination and their likely real impact on knowledge and culture were enormous. The library's aim, at least in later stories, was to collect all books in the world. Royal agents supposedly acquired texts by purchase, copying, or even temporary confiscation of scrolls from visiting ships. The collection included works in Greek, poetry, drama, philosophy, history, science, but likely also texts in other languages, including Egyptian and Near Eastern traditions, translated into Greek where possible. The library and the museum together gave Alexandria an identity, unlike any other city in the ancient world. They were not just repositories of texts. They were institutions of organized inquiry, supported by the court and tied to the prestige of the dynasty. In practical terms, that meant the Ptolemies were investing in intellectual authority as a form of power. The museum functioned as a community of scholars, supported by royal patronage, who lived and worked in Alexandria. They studied, edited, and commented on texts, conducted research in fields such as astronomy, mathematics, geography, and medicine, and sometimes advised the king. Figures like Euclid, Eratosthenes, and others are associated with this milieu, contributing to the city's reputation as a global center of learning. This environment mattered not only for scholarship, but for statecraft. Knowledge could be used to organize territory, interpret the past, and project cultural superiority. The Ptolemies were rulers who understood that books, charts, and learned reputation could strengthen a kingdom just as effectively as fortresses and fleets. For Egyptian history specifically, the Alexandrian scholarly environment played a major role in how Greek and later Roman writers understood and recorded Egypt's past. Egyptian priests and Greek historians, working together or in dialogue, produced chronologies, king lists, and interpretive works that attempted to systematize the vast and complex record of pharaonic dynasties. These efforts shaped the historical framework that modern scholarship still engages with, even as we correct and refine it, using archaeological evidence. That legacy is important because it means Alexandria was not only a center of learning for its own age, it became a filter through which later generations understood Egypt itself. The city did not merely preserve knowledge, it organized the way Egypt would be remembered. Early Ptolemaic foreign policy and conflict. The early Ptolemies had to defend their new kingdom not only against internal unrest, but also against powerful rivals among Alexander's successors. They engaged in a series of conflicts, often called the Syrian Wars, with the Seleucid Empire based in Asia. Control of the eastern Mediterranean coast, Syria and Palestine, was at stake both for strategic reasons and for access to trade routes. These wars were part of the broader struggle among the successors of Alexander to divide up and stabilize the imperial inheritance. Egypt's position was unique because it was wealthy, defensible, and commercially valuable. But it was also exposed, especially in regions beyond the Nile Valley, where influence had to be maintained by naval power, diplomacy, and military settlements. These wars involved naval battles, sieges, and shifting alliances with smaller states and Greek city-states. At times, the Ptolemies held key coastal cities and islands. At other times, they lost ground and had to renegotiate their position. The need to maintain a strong military presence and loyal subject populations in contested regions further encouraged the Ptolemies to invest in fortifications, garrisons, and diplomatic marriages. The Syrian Wars also reveal how the Ptolemaic kingdom thought strategically. It was not simply defending territory, it was defending roots, prestige, and access. Control of southern Syria could shape the entire eastern Mediterranean balance. That is why the conflict between the Ptolemies and Seleucids endured for so long. It was about the geography of power. Within Egypt, the demands of these external conflicts could exacerbate tensions. Heavy taxation and military recruitment might strain rural communities. Greek and Macedonian soldiers settled as clerics. Landholding soldiers could come into conflict with local populations if their privileges and behavior were seen as oppressive. The monarchy had to balance the needs of war and empire with the imperative of keeping the Nile Valley relatively stable and productive. That balance was never easy. Military success abroad could create pressure at home. A kingdom that was too aggressive in foreign policy might exhaust its domestic base. Yet a kingdom that withdrew too far inward risked losing influence and prestige. The Ptolemies had to walk that line continuously. Social tensions and revolts under the early Ptolemies. Despite the careful balancing act, social tensions under Ptolemaic rule did occasionally erupt into open revolts, especially in Upper Egypt. In some cases, local leaders or priests rallied Egyptian populations against what they viewed as foreign exploitation, invoking traditional religious imagery and promises of justice. Such uprisings could be geographically limited or more widespread, depending on local conditions and the degree of central control. These revolts remind us that the Ptolemaic kingdom was not universally accepted, especially outside the main centers of Greek power. Upper Egypt in particular could become a zone of resistance, where local loyalties, temple authority, and grievances over taxation or administration fed unrest. The king's authority remained strongest where his institutions were most dense and most visible. The monarchy responded with a mix of repression and accommodation. Military campaigns were launched to retake rebellious areas, punish leaders, and reassert royal authority. At the same time, kings might negotiate settlements, issue decrees that adjusted tax burdens, or grant new privileges to temples and local elites to win back support. These episodes reveal that Ptolemaic rule, while often portrayed as heavy-handed, was also pragmatic and adaptable when necessary. Over the long term, these patterns deepened a sense of distinction between the Greek-dominated urban centers and the largely Egyptian countryside. Yet they also contributed to a gradual blending of cultures, as each side learned the language, customs, and expectations of the other in order to manage ongoing coexistence and negotiation. What emerges here is not a simple picture of domination and resistance. It is a more complicated society in which power was constantly being renegotiated. Egyptian communities could resist Ptolemaic authority without rejecting all forms of accommodation. Greek elites could rule Egypt while gradually absorbing local practices. The kingdom remained stable enough to survive, but only because its rulers learned to govern through compromise as well as force. The long arc toward Roman intervention. By the later 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the Ptolemaic kingdom began to show signs of strain. Internal dynastic conflicts, often involving sibling rivalries, assassinations, and civil wars, weakened central authority. Economic pressures from prolonged wars, palace extravagance, and the challenges of maintaining a complex bureaucracy took their toll. Provincial unrest, particularly in Upper Egypt, flared repeatedly. This deterioration was gradual, not sudden. The kingdom still retained wealth, institutions, and international significance, but its coherence became harder to maintain. The more complex the court politics became, the more difficult it was to balance the demands of the army, the temple system, the bureaucracy, and the royal tax base. Rare legitimacy remained important, but it was increasingly contested by family members, rival claimants, and local power brokers. At the same time, a new great power was emerging in the Western Mediterranean, Rome. Initially focused on Italy and the Western Sea, Rome gradually extended its influence eastward, defeating Carthage, intervening in Greek affairs, and eventually confronting the Seleucid Empire. Egypt watched these developments with interest and anxiety, sometimes seeking Roman friendship as a counterweight to closer rivals. Early contacts between Ptolemaic rulers and Rome included diplomatic exchanges, trade, and mutual recognition of interests. For a while, Rome preferred to keep Egypt independent but friendly as a useful ally and a major grain supplier. Egyptian rulers, for their part, sometimes invited Roman arbitration in dynastic disputes, unwittingly opening the door to deeper Roman involvement in their internal affairs. That last point is one of the great ironies of the late Hellenistic period. In trying to use Rome as a tool in their own internal struggles, the Ptolemies helped create the conditions for Rome's eventual dominance. The kingdom that had begun as a clever solution to the fragmentation of Alexander's empire would eventually be drawn into a much larger imperial system.
Next, we will be exploring Ptolemaic Egypt and Cleopatra VII, joined by our resident Egyptian expert. Join us next time on Blind History with Josh Berry.